As dusk settled and the sun dipped below the horizon, a band of weary travelers struggled through the dense forest, their progress slowed by the encroaching darkness. The group traveled along the path commonly used by the company for trading. However, after covering a long distance, one member noticed they were no longer on the right track. Frustration welled up inside him as he came to terms with wandering through the forest so late at night. The atmosphere within the caravan became increasingly uneasy when a member directly questioned their leader about whether he had ever traveled this route before. The man regretted his decision to sign the contract and to employ just 10 guards. He reflected that, had he realized how challenging the road would become, he never would have started this journey at all. Attempted to support his viewpoint, insisting that this was not their initial expedition. He explained their confusion by mentioning that the landscape and mountains often shifted as years passed. At the same time, and watched the events unfold. Considered the possibility that if the merchants were honest about remembering the path, then something from outside must have altered the landscape. Suddenly, his expression turned sharp as he shouted a warning at him, his voice edged with frustration. Without any hint of alarm, swiftly unsheathed his sword and charged ahead at full speed, just as a monster launched a sudden assault on the group. The men stood frozen in disbelief, as they realized the creature before them was clad in armor crafted by the Uruks. They instantly understood that they had been caught in a carefully planned ambush. Quickly commanded everyone to stay together, cautioning that anyone who left the group would be swallowed up without hesitation. The guards realized they were trapped, with innumerable pairs of shining eyes emerging from the shadows encircling them. Filled with worry, inquired about how many there were, but his companion cautioned him against attempting to count them. At that moment, the monsters unleashed a fierce and total assault. A fierce and brutal fight broke out, leaving bloodshed in its wake. The fighters shouted desperately, demanding the end of the monsters. In the midst of the turmoil, could hardly believe how savage the battle had become, finding it shocking even though their enemies were monsters. He quickly fell quiet when gave him a harsh warning. Silently promised that, if the merchants survived this ordeal, he would ensure they suffered greatly for what they had done. Once the first group of monsters had been defeated, cautioned his teammates to stay alert, emphasizing that monster traps were relentless and rarely stopped after just one attack. Interrupted just as the last word left his companion's lips, raising his hand and directing everyone's attention toward the distant horizon. A gigantic troll creature suddenly emerged. The sudden appearance of a troll, coming right after their struggle with left everyone frozen in shock and fear. Fear surged through the group as the men realized the danger they faced. One man urgently insisted that everyone scatter at once, warning that if they stayed, the troll would destroy them all in an instant. Surrendered to hopelessness, convinced that his fate was sealed and that none of the mercenaries would survive. Studied the scene closely, his mind racing with questions about whether the troll was meant to be a combat animal or if it was a runaway weapon. The thought of manufacturing so many of these beasts in a woodland setting left him feeling confused and uneasy. Understood that there was no longer any way out. He swiftly gave commands, directing 2 of his soldiers to shield the merchants and bring them together, while instructing to catch the troll's eye and lure it away from the group when it hurled its next object. Adamantly opposed the proposal, accusing of madness. He insisted that the best chance for survival lay in offering up the merchants as bait to secure their own escape. He turned to, inquiring about any ideas they might have. Assured him that a strategy was in place, one that would instantly recognize. Their approach involved watching for a moment when the troll became preoccupied, then making a swift dash beneath its legs, an old tactic they had relied on throughout numerous previous encounters. Even as he asked the question, fear became obvious. He quietly confessed that he would prefer death over having to go through the experience once more. While hurrying to carry out the plan, he came to an abrupt halt when something unusual caught his attention. He noticed that the troll's gaze was fixed elsewhere, completely ignoring their presence as it stared off in another direction. Just as the troll prepared to strike, an unexpected force slammed it down to the ground so powerfully that it was hurled high into the air. It eventually rose, bewildered and confused, trying to make sense of the situation. He turned to and inquired about the method he used to defeat such a colossal creature. Could not be blamed for what happened. Out of the shadows, a new creature appeared, this one bigger and far more frightening, its piercing blue eyes shining in the gloom. The unfamiliar being moved forward with a quiet confidence, approaching the lifeless body of the defeated troll. Surrounded by mercenaries and merchants who could hardly believe their eyes. The monster lifted the troll's lifeless body, and without a hint of emotion, squeezed its head until it shattered under the pressure of its bare hands. Fear took hold of one merchant, prompting him to seek answers from about what kind of horrifying creature they faced. Explained that, being from the city, he probably had no knowledge of it, and that within this forest, the creature was known to be the fiercest of them all. The tales were so terrifying that people believed anyone who faced the creature would never come back alive. After building suspense, he finally disclosed that the beast was actually an ogre. The mention of that name left the merchant completely stunned. Went on to elaborate, making it clear that even though encounters with ogres were uncommon, among all the monsters, these creatures stand out for their unmatched power and swift movements, paired with sharp wits and relentless determination when pursuing their prey. Could hardly believe his eyes as he came face to face with a being he had previously known only through stories, and the shock of meeting it during such a dangerous moment left him speechless. At the same time, the merchants whispered among themselves, trying to figure out why the mercenaries stood motionless, unable to react. Hesitated, uncertain about his next move, as thoughts of escaping crossed his mind. However, he soon understood that any attempt to run would only turn him into the monster's prey. He sank to the ground, overcome by hopelessness. The ogre moved closer to where lay on the ground, its hands smeared with blood. To his surprise, the creature reached out and addressed him directly. He explained that he had faced many hardships himself and promised to lead the way from this point forward. The ogre offered comfort, urging him to have courage and not feel fear. The creature revealed that, although it looked different, it shared the very same blood as humans. He went on to disclose who he really was, announcing himself as, and explaining that he possessed both human and ogre heritage. Following the events, guided the whole caravan as they made their way through the dense forest. The journey continued until they finally arrived at Village, a secluded settlement nestled within the borders of the kingdom. When the group neared the sturdy wooden barriers surrounding the village, a watchful guard stationed overhead spotted their arrival and demanded to know who they were. After making it through safely, a sense of relief washed over everyone in the caravan. Clearly exhausted and aching, groaned that he believed he wouldn't make it. Meanwhile, grumbled under his breath, sending a few sharp words toward the traders. Then led the group toward the edge of the village, and one of the travelers wondered aloud if the barrier had been built to protect them from monsters. The guard, who was later known as, greeted with astonishment. He wondered aloud about how long had been gone, and was curious about the identities of the companions standing beside him. Responded to S. greeting, explaining that the people with him belonged to a merchant caravan on their way to the village. He mentioned meeting them earlier while collecting firewood, and noted that they had already introduced themselves to the village chief. Even with the explanation given, doubts lingered. He assured that he believed what he said, yet pointed out that there had been no notice of a caravan scheduled to arrive now. Went on to share his worry that they could actually be bandits pretending to be traders. His face flushed with anger as he protested loudly, insisting they were innocent and had merely gotten lost because their village chief had originally misled them with incorrect directions. Despite the pleas, remained firm, prioritizing the safety of the village above all else. He informed the group that unless they could verify who they were, they would be forced to depart. The merchant, clearly exasperated by the circumstances, insisted that the guard should summon the village chief without delay. Stepped into the discussion, clarifying to that while keeping everyone safe mattered, the group's presence was necessary. He shared that as he traveled, he sensed the forest calling out in distress, which led him to believe that changes in the path signaled interference in the woods, suggesting their assistance could be crucial. Sought to calm the guard's worries by promising that, should any trouble arise, he would take responsibility and resolve it personally. After gaining permission to go inside, the setting changed to the village hall. The members of the caravan gathered with the village chief, and several local residents. The chief, who was an older gentleman, joined the others in laughter as they echoed, claimed that he would take care of the situation on his own, clearly taken aback by his boldness. Believed the chief's response was exaggerated, whereas a merchant felt grateful that they had managed to survive and reach their destination unharmed. Acknowledged impressive might, remarking that his strength surpassed that of 10 seasoned mercenaries put together. The peace was quickly interrupted when started interrogating the village chief. He mentioned the protective barriers he had observed while approaching, noting that these defenses appeared to encircle the whole settlement. Despite knowing that creatures like monsters and uruks were likely to appear in such an isolated area, he thought the security measures seemed far too extreme. This caused him to bluntly question whether they were getting ready for a conflict, surprising everyone with his directness. Gazed at in astonishment, silently noting how always managed to make the most ill-timed remarks. A quiet hush settled over the room for several moments before the chief broke the silence. He acknowledged the horrors of war, openly recognizing its dreadful nature. Turning to, he speculated, based on his rugged look, that the man had once been a mercenary, possibly hailing from. The chief went on to describe war as it was seen in his era, portraying it as a holy uprising meant to free his people from the uruks, who had oppressed humans and regarded them as nothing more than livestock. He realized that modern conflicts had changed. Instead of fighting for noble causes, they now resulted in pointless violence driven by greed, leaving devastation for everyone involved. He shared his wish that disasters like these would never come to their village. They wanted everyone to see that these barriers existed solely because people had wished and prayed for safety and peace, forming a stronghold from their hopes. Cut off the chief mid-speech, criticizing his reasoning as distorted, and accusing him of dressing up the harsh reality of a weapon of war with eloquent language. He mentioned that he might have believed the explanation had it concerned only the barriers. However, he gestured toward and referred to him as a monster. Wondered aloud about the logic behind using mere words to explain the presence of a creature strong enough to defeat a troll with just one strike, viewing such overwhelming strength as something disturbingly abnormal. He clarified that discussions of war were difficult for, and showing that was not merely a weapon would require proof that a terrible hybrid like him was one of a kind. Took offense at being described as horrific, while observed that language was unkind. Traces of discomfort became visible across expression. At that moment, expressed his understanding of why they struggled to accept him. He acknowledged that unless they believed he meant no harm, they might tell others the village was unsafe. He explained that, luckily, he had a plan to win them over and suggested they could meet his mother. Guided the others toward a nearby house. As they walked, wrinkled his nose and grumbled about an unpleasant odor. In response, explained that he had marked the area with his urine to deter any nearby monsters. Walked up to the front door of the house and announced his arrival, letting his mother know that he had returned. Stepped inside, offering an apology for his tardiness, and explaining that a few tasks in the village had held him up. His mother, a youthful woman with hair, greeted the guests warmly and urged them to come inside without delay. 15 years earlier, the story shifted to the quiet surroundings of village. On that distant evening, the village chief, appearing more youthful than usual, hurried toward the wooden barricade once a guard alerted him about a looming threat. Uncertain about the situation unfolding before them, the guards decided to summon the chief so he could witness it firsthand. When the chief arrived, he was struck motionless by fear at the sight of an enormous creature with eyes that glowed red, looming menacingly in front of the barrier. He instantly identified the creature before him as an ogre. The chief commanded the group to lower their weapons and fall back without delay. He cautioned them against angering the creature, having recognized it from the monster guide. The creature was called, a famous ogre feared throughout the land as both the wolf of the forest and the butcher of the central continent. The chief came to the alarming conclusion that the group was up against the deadliest beast they had ever seen. Recognizing the creature's strength as it threatened to shatter the barrier with ease, he urgently ordered his people to bring siege weapons at once. One of the villagers brought the chief's attention to the odd way the monster was acting. Even after several hours had slipped by, the ogre remained completely motionless. The villagers found themselves confused by the creature's actions. They questioned whether the guide had given any explanation for this unusual behavior, or if perhaps the monster desired something more than just a hunt. The chief weighed the situation with growing concern. The ogre's gaze shifted abruptly toward a figure sprawled across the ground. The crowd stared in astonishment as the ogre turned away and started to depart. The creature sprang away from the village, disappearing into the distance. They lingered carefully, their eyes scanning the area, until one of them silently indicated the individual whom the ogre had abandoned. As they drew closer, they realized there was a living person inside. The story shifts back to the current time, set inside a home located on the edge of village. The members of the caravan gathered at a table alongside, and his mother, a young woman with hair. As enjoyed his meal with delight, savoring the cheese and ham his mother had made, she gently reminded him to slow down while eating. His mother expressed regret to the visitors about the simple meal, mentioning that their arrival had been unexpected and that her son had not informed her in advance. She expressed her regret for the difficulties they had endured on their journey to such an isolated location. She turned her attention to and asked him why they had come to this place. Detected a peculiar accent in the woman's speech and leaned in to quietly share his observation with. Explained that this manner of speaking belonged exclusively to those of noble or royal heritage, then grumbled under his breath about how repulsive he found the local villagers. His mother appeared to grasp what they were thinking before anyone said a word, silently admitting that her daily life with her son in this house was anything but normal. She explained that even the mere sight of those individuals could create trouble, no matter what reasons she tried to give. She reminded everyone that she had previously expressed regret for her son's thoughtless actions outdoors and assured them it would not be repeated, questioning if there was anything else she could do to make her visitors feel at ease. Observed that she spoke as if she were striking a deal. When she mentioned the existence of a merchant guild, she implied that this should help them come to terms more quickly. Reacted with frustration to this tactic, demanding to know from whether there was room for discussion, and highlighting how the noblewoman was sidestepping a direct response. He pressed further, claiming that, as a representative of he deserved honesty, responded by attempting to soothe agitation. She reminded him that it was her son who had rescued them, insisting they should simply be thankful and move on, but appeared intent on prolonging the dispute. Paid no attention to his efforts to soothe him, his voice growing louder as he pressed mother for answers. He insisted that she justify how someone of her reputation could end up concealed in such a location, and demanded to know what could have compelled her to bring a wild, half-human child into the world. His mother attempted to intervene, pointing out that his remarks were unkind, yet ignored her concerns and snapped back, insisting that she should reflect on her own situation before criticizing others. He considered her pitiful, noting that she endured such a fate in isolation, lacking the courage to confront the turmoil beyond her secluded surroundings. Launched into a passionate monologue about the horrors of war, expressing his anguish over the loss of his fellow soldiers who were being killed in combat. He explained that the unending desire to win among the fighting countries had pushed them so far that they resorted to unleashing demons on the battlefield. He made a solemn vow to always remember the horrors that had been carried out in the struggle to claim that land. He finished his speech with a strong expression of revulsion, appalled that one of the revolting hybrid war weapons had turned up even in such a remote location. At that moment, shouted out Tillich's name, causing him to fall silent right away. Taking control of the situation, calmly but firmly turned his attention to Smother, ready to interrogate her. He wanted to know whether she and her son were the hidden secret the villagers had been protecting with their many defenses. Next, he pressed her to explain what deep resentment could lead a woman of her reputation to willingly bear the child of the infamous Crimson King. His mother appeared visibly shaken and implored the others to believe that they misunderstood the situation, struggling to convey how complicated it was for her to reveal what had really happened. Made an attempt to shield his mother, calling out to her in distress, but remained unmoved and demanded that she confess honestly. Interrupted once more, his tone laced with sarcasm, questioning whether the motive was not resentment, but rather an unusual preference for associating with people from different races. Before had a chance to complete his thought, his mother cried out in fear, her voice ringing with a desperate plea for him to stop. At that instant, suddenly felt a powerful, unseen energy slam into him, sending him crashing to the floor. Blood streamed from his wounds while he struggled to catch his breath. His mother collapsed onto the floor as she desperately reached out in an attempt to prevent him from leaving. Turned out to be the cause of the attack, standing upright and breathing hard, while an unusual red, spider-shaped mark had formed on his chest. Stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Sprang into action, swiftly reaching out to seize. Glanced anxiously at his actions, his gaze shifting to his mother as concern filled his eyes. As his mother hurried over, urging him to relax, weakly addressed her, softly calling out for his mom. Took advantage of the situation, moving closer to the group as his eyes shined with anticipation. Shifted into a more animalistic shape, his teeth growing sharper and his ears becoming pointed, as he gave a clear warning to stay away from his mother. Made it clear that his sword was never pointed in his mother's direction. No longer appeared human to him, his gaze saw only something unrecognizable. His mother cried out in fear for her son, her voice filled with concern. Quickly tried to ease her worries, explaining that he had taken care not to cause any real harm. The strike had simply been meant to subdue the boy. His expression shifted unexpectedly as surprise his features. He noticed with surprise that his attack had failed to pierce body in any way. Realized that the ogre's unique blood made it resistant, and understood that only a deep, forceful strike could have any real effect. At the same time, observed that couldn't take his eyes off his mother, and it dawned on him that she could be in danger next. He quickly shifted into a defensive position to stop the next blow, but seized him and hurled him aside. Sprang to his feet and advanced toward, shifting their confrontation into the shadowy woods illuminated by the glow of the moon. Found himself overwhelmed as he confronted the sheer force that possessed. He observed that, despite being consumed by anger, the man still displayed sharp instincts by selecting a spacious area for the battle, one that accommodated his massive frame. At that moment, became aware of a more profound truth. Carefully considered each action, making sure that nothing he did would put his mother at risk in their home. Moved in swiftly, launching a close-range attack at, however, reacted with ease, effortlessly evading strike. Stood in shock, noticing that was expertly copying his fighting techniques, and he wondered how could have picked them up with such speed. Struck with such force that fell to the ground. Observed the situation with worry, understanding that faced serious danger. His mother approached the scene of the confrontation, while himself to strike one last time. Suddenly, specks of glowing light started to descend from above. At that instant, came to a clear conclusion. He had witnessed more than he needed. It dawned on him that with only a brief look had already figured out his tactics and was ready to strike back with flawless precision. He acknowledged that would have died instantly from the counterattack, if not for the bright green pendant hanging around his neck. He marveled at the presence of a device that could so effectively subdue a wild ogre. Recalled his mother, and noted how impressive she was for managing the strength her son possessed. His nerves slowly settled, and as he regained his composure, moved closer and expressed his regret in a respectful manner. Clarified that, because he belonged to, he was required to handle the dangers posed by hybrids, who were often turned into instruments of warfare, with great care. He confessed that his strong reaction came from never encountering a situation like this before. Afterward, he assured that he now recognized him simply as a smart and well-mannered boy trying to fit into the world. He also vowed that his team would protect their secret, ensuring the safety of both and his mother. Regained his composure and shifted back to his usual self, his face and posture betraying how utterly drained he felt. As evening settled in, his mother beckoned him, urging him to take a break and rest since the hour was growing late. In response, approached her and wrapped his arms around her in a warm embrace. Tears streamed down his face as he clung to her, desperately reaching out for his mother. Outside was sprawled on the ground, wounded and muttering bitter complaints about everything that had happened. When morning arrived, the caravan departed from the village. His mother stood inside her home, busy with the task of making a meal. Once she had arranged everything on the table, she chose not to join the meal. Instead, she chose to wait patiently for her son, who would come back once he was done leading the caravan along its route. The focus moves to, as he guides the caravan along the chosen route. Traveled with the caravan, grumbling about how the trip back seemed more difficult than when they first arrived. Questioned in his mind the reason behind their choice to travel along such a twisting path. Explained that his decision was influenced not only by a desire to stay out of harm's way, but also by a sense that the forest itself was guiding him toward safety. He promised the group that after they made it through the forest, the rest of their journey would be free from danger. The caravan had begun its journey along the edge of territory. The merchant hauled the unconscious Tilak and gave his word that he would reward the merchant handsomely for his help. Had become part of their group, taking on the responsibility to steer and support them throughout their journey. The caravan moved forward on its path, with referring to as his uncle. Expressed regret too about the bumpy ride, yet he comforted him by mentioning that the city was not far ahead. Appeared visibly relieved and wondered aloud whether felt exhausted from the long nights spent fixing up his home. However, simply shrugged it off, insisting the work had not bothered him at all. Filled with excitement, shared with that throughout their journey, he had been recalling the tales of adventure once told him about the city, a place he had only recognized by its distant scent. Reacts with astonishment upon realizing that is unfamiliar with these tales, while reveals that both the villagers and his mother had always steered clear of discussing them. A seasoned merchant speculated that people feared, still young and inexperienced, could easily fall victim to deception beyond the safety of home. However, also believed that true growth only comes from facing and overcoming difficulties. Reflected on how much he had liked listening to Uncle's stories, the merchant famous for understanding the forest and for his sharp skill in making deals, always offering hard-to-resist discounts that led to his business success. Began to question whether learning this technique could help him endure life in the city. Watching his curiosity grow, the merchant started to regret sharing the secret, worried that might try to copy it and end up causing problems for himself. Wondered aloud whether had ever ventured beyond the borders of his home village, and questioned if the village chief prevented him from leaving. Clarified that no such restriction was placed upon him. Remaining in was a decision he made for himself. He shares his thoughts, admitting that at times he believes the village barrier exists solely to shield him, since this village is the one place where he truly feels accepted for who he is. He goes on to share a deeper reason, explaining that his mother is living by herself. After giving birth to him, she lost the ability to walk for the rest of her life. He claimed ignorance of her suffering, explaining that she had always concealed her pain. However, he learned from the villagers that she belonged to a respected noble family. Realized that she had sacrificed all she had for his sake, making it impossible for him to abandon her just to follow his own wishes. Observing this, the merchant remarked that the situation was regrettable. Reflected on the hardships of his childhood, recalling how his ogre heritage left him craving only raw meat as a youngster, a revelation that deeply unsettled the merchant. Abruptly shifted the conversation, turning to and inquiring if he had previously been instructed to keep watch over the guild's trading path through the forest. Became visibly flustered and attempted to avoid the situation by insisting their encounter was purely accidental. However, remained persistent, firmly stating that he was incapable of telling a lie. The merchant expressed his gratitude for being rescued, yet he admitted that trouble could arise if his actions were guided by hidden instructions. Explains that the situation has nothing to do with conflict or anything scary. He finally admitted what he had been hiding. Uruk bandits had overrun the woods encircling their village. Even with their small numbers, they posed a serious threat to both traveling merchants and minor mercenary bands. The disruption of trade routes began to threaten the very way the village survived. Comes to understand that the village's secrecy stems from this very reason, and he recognizes that has been spreading his scent throughout the forest to claim the area and intimidate any potential threats. His response confirms suspicions. Noted that the bandits' footprints vanished without warning, suggesting that the village's fortifications may have played a role in their sudden disappearance. He is convinced that his role as the forest ogre left the most significant mark. Wondered aloud whether his actions were simply to protect the village's reputation. Shook his head, insisting that his reasons went beyond that. Unveiled the true threat, explaining that the Uruks had begun to behave oddly. They were now taming fierce creatures like trolls, and had even started altering the very landscape of the forest. He mentions that the atmosphere in the forest gives the impression that it is pleading for assistance. Attempted to maintain an optimistic tone, reassuring that everything would turn out all right, and insisting he could handle any issues on his own if it came to that. However, his words abruptly trailed off. He gestured forward, signaling that they had reached their destination, the bustling city of. Approached the gates of Ridden City alongside the caravan. At the entrance, took a moment to say goodbye, expressing gratitude for his help in bringing them there. Despite their differences in race, told that the bond they shared was truly valuable to him. The merchant shares his optimism, believing that will eventually have the chance to leave his village and see the world beyond. Let out a quiet chuckle, and the merchant offered reassurance, hinting that the chance might be simpler to seize than imagined. The merchant went on to propose that consider joining the Noon Circus Troupe, a traveling circus group known for welcoming people of various backgrounds, suggesting this could be a way for to see the world and make a living. Reacts with astonishment at how much the merchant knows about these matters, while the merchant pretends to be offended in response. Lifted his hand in farewell, watching the caravan roll through the city gates and disappear into the bustling streets. Once they disappeared from sight, his face shifted to reveal deep concern as he glanced back toward the forest. He wished that everything in the village had remained peaceful while he was away. He swiftly heads toward the village. 8 years earlier, the story shifts to a moment in the past. In the scene, a person approached, who was just 5 years old at the time. Playfully remarked that had gotten much bigger and taller than most children his age. His mother herself in the kitchen, carefully slicing and arranging pieces of meat as she prepared their meal. The man's voice softened with sorrow as he explained that looking at him brought back memories of his own youth, a time marked by the loss of his family, his home, and all he had once known. Forced to escape into the perilous woods, they fled from the Lord and the knights. When he reached his 10th birthday, the man explained that he thought village was the one place where both he and his mother could truly belong. Every resident there had endured similar hardships and sorrow. The story shifts back to the present as races toward his village. However, he abruptly halts when he notices smoke billowing up from where his village lies. Panic overtakes him, propelling him into a frantic sprint as he desperately searches for his mother, his bewilderment deepening when he notices that no signs of monsters remain nearby. As he approached, he noticed flames consuming the village barrier and experienced a brief sense of comfort, realizing that his own house remained untouched by the fire. However, upon stepping into the blazing woods, he notices that the scent of the fire seems unusual, leading him to understand that the flames were set on purpose, and incense was burned alongside them to mask the village's natural aroma. Found himself questioning who could have committed the act and what had driven them to it. The urgency of the situation struck him, and he understood that he needed to hurry back right away. As he continued on his journey, he came across the same man he remembered talking to, now gravely injured, his body pierced by arrows. Hesitated, finding it difficult to pronounce name. Attempts to assist him, lifting him up and heading toward the village in search of medical aid. Halted the others' movements, recognizing that his own end was near. With his final breaths, he offered a last caution before passing away. He tells that upon returning to the village, must stay calm and keep his thoughts clear regardless of what awaits him there. Following's passing, moves forward, carrying both grief and resolve within him. As approaches the entrance to the village, memories of his last words echo in his mind. At that spot, he witnesses a terrifying sight. Rows of disciplined soldiers lined up along the barricades, releasing volleys of arrows toward the creatures swarming beneath them. Arrived at the scene, expecting chaos from wild monsters, but instead he discovered a disciplined force of monsters. They had strategically gathered beneath the protective barriers, launching a relentless shower of arrows onto the villagers below. Commander Kane stood atop the battlements, instructing the defenders to ready their weapons. He stressed the importance of aiming at the trolls hauling ladders, knowing that these invaders had already begun their ascent up the wall. Kane struggled to understand how a small group of Uruk bandits had suddenly transformed into a well-organized army, and he felt convinced that a hidden force was orchestrating this calculated assault. Without warning, a member of his group cried out his name, his finger trembling as he indicated something frightening just past the enemy lines. A gigantic, fearsome beast, with eyes shining an eerie red, emerged from behind the ranks of soldiers. Mounted atop a massive creature resembling a wolf, known as she made her way forward. Fear swept through the defenders as they tried to imagine who these mysterious attackers could be and how many there were. None of them had ever witnessed anyone who could control a before. Kane recognized the leader as an Uruk hailing from the wastelands, a type of warrior typically encountered only during the fierce battles of. The Uruk's unexpected appearance in this place caught Kane off guard. Without warning, an arrow flew through the air and struck one of the defenders, causing him to scream in agony. Kane turned to his soldiers, making it clear that the Uruk assault was no ordinary raid. The arrow was more than just a weapon, it bore a message. As he realized this, Kane instructed his men to tend to the injured warrior and stop the bleeding. The Uruk commander quickly gave instructions for something to be dispatched without delay. It appeared that his words were meant specifically for the village's little ogre. Beneath the walls, the invaders pressed on with their assault, struggling to scale the ladders in their relentless attempt to breach the defenses. Kane commanded his soldiers to get ready, instructing them to unleash a storm of arrows to stop their enemies from climbing upward. Arrows shot through the air with fierce intensity. The Uruk commander's deputy observed the clash on the battlefield with a look of disdain, surprised by the unexpected courage shown by the villagers in their resistance. At that instant, an arrow struck him, and he collapsed to the earth lifeless. The towering commander climbed down from his enormous creature, his eyes sweeping over the gathered humans with clear contempt. At the same time, a member of the defending group picked up the dropped message, curious about what it said, and realized that the text was written in a language different from Uruk's. The monster commander gave instructions to his subordinates, who then escorted a group of captured humans into the area. Kane was ready to command his archers to release another round of arrows, but before he could speak, one of his soldiers stepped forward, halted him, and pointed out something that caught his attention. The defenders realized with shock that the scouts they had dispatched earlier, among them, were now under the control of the enemy and being guided back toward their lines. Kane urgently called out to the others, insisting they stop their assault after he noticed the adversaries were hiding behind their own allies as protection. Kane spotted his son trapped among the hostages. Overwhelmed by the sight, he fell to his knees, his mind racing with anguish as he struggled to understand why fate had turned so cruel. One of the men alerted Kane to the fact that the assailants were moving closer to the barrier gate, pressing him to choose a course of action without delay. From below, a field commander instructed his troops to form a barrier, even if it meant sacrificing themselves, fully aware that the village's fate depended on keeping the gate secure. Inside a nearby building, several villagers took cover, their faces tense with worry. Among them, one villager, voice trembling, questioned the group, expressing fear and confusion about remaining hidden when they could be out strengthening the gates. Another warrior interrupted the group, observing that their earlier fights with monsters had been strangely effortless. This warrior argued that continuing to fight in this manner was pointless and suggested that the attackers must be targeting something in particular. Outside, the Uruks hauled a massive wooden log and started smashing it against the main gate. The defenders positioned behind the barrier struggled to withstand the fierce impacts, their efforts evident as they fought desperately to maintain their grip. Beyond the village walls, the Uruk commander engaged in conversation with another individual. The second person admired how the battle was unfolding and observed that the village's defenses would likely collapse soon because of the commander's skill in warfare. He also assured the commander that, as agreed, he would assist him with his hunt. At the same time, atop the wall, One of the men pressed Kane to act swiftly and resolve the crisis. Kane wrestled with intense turmoil within himself as his son, trapped among the hostages, weakly reached out to him by calling, "Father." A warrior moved ahead and informed Kane that the group had reached a decision. He acknowledged Kane's reluctance, knowing it was his son in danger, but explained that there was no alternative to rescue him, and he apologized for the painful decision they had to make. Kane hesitated, unable to command his archers to release their arrows. The warrior expressed regret for his actions, while a different protector stepped forward and instructed the archers to ready their arrows. Without warning, a figure sprang down from the trees, moving with astonishing swiftness. With a deafening crash, they struck the ground in the middle of the Uruk army. The Uruk commander greeted his arrival, remarking that the small ogre had at last shown himself. Monsters scattered in every direction as the force of his landing struck the ground. Chaos and surprise rippled through the defenders stationed on the wall, leaving them reeling. Amidst the turmoil, Kane's thoughts swirled with uncertainty as he questioned whether the figure before him could truly be. The Uruk commander addressed his unseen ally once more, reporting that their target had fallen for the trap just as they had intended, and then inquired about his ally's next move. Amidst the chaos of the battlefield, relentlessly defeated monster after monster. During the fight, he noticed injured and sprawled helplessly on the ground. Someone struggled to call out to him. Upon hearing the voice, rushed over in alarm, urgently shouting his brother's name. Was consumed by anger, causing him to lash out uncontrollably. From across the clearing, the Uruk commander called out, his tone filled with astonishment upon spotting a half-ogre, a rare hybrid considered the most formidable of monsters, lurking in an isolated area instead of fighting on the front lines. He followed up with a mocking question, pointing out that it was strange no one had tried to end his life before this moment. The story shifts to an earlier time, uncovering who this Uruk truly was. He belonged to the Uruks who hailed from barren lands, a place that had once been for a fierce conflict among different races. The group had earned a reputation as formidable war mercenaries in that land. Born from both human and Uruk lineage, they possessed the advantages of each race, demonstrating exceptional skill with weapons, strong leadership abilities, and mastery of tactics. Their population remained extremely limited, as they could only be created using an ancient magical technique that had long since been forgotten. After the war concluded, they found themselves penniless. They started making money by taking on various risky hunting jobs. They guarded their territories fiercely, constantly battling to stay alive. They stood their ground, undeterred even by the notorious reputation of the ogres. Yet, despite their relentless efforts throughout the fierce struggle, just a single individual was left behind. Over time, the title Uruk, once used to describe an entire people, came to represent just one person. During the next several years, the lone survivor guarded a secluded woodland on the outskirts of Arena's kingdom. He kept a careful watch on the child of his people's foe, quietly biding his time until he could finally take his revenge. The Uruk commander commanded his troops to overwhelm, instructing them to attack him simultaneously and leave no opportunity for him to defend himself. He instructed his team to carry out both the troll subjugation formation and the null encirclement formation at the same time. Even with all their careful planning, the Uruk soldiers found themselves falling back, unable to stand against its overwhelming strength. Watching the battlefield, a commander among the Uruk ranks questioned in disbelief how just one ogre was managing to stop their entire force, slowly coming to the painful understanding that they were sending their warriors to their deaths for nothing. From their positions atop the village walls, the defenders observed a sudden change as the Uruks stopped moving toward the village and focused entirely on. Unease rippled through the group as they worried whether could handle the overwhelming number of foes by himself. Kane observed as battled, only to see Foot suddenly ensnared by a well-aimed strike. The Uruk commander personally joined the fight, clashing intensely with. The pair traded glances. The strikes landed with unforgiving force. Despite suffering grave injuries and the loss of several limbs, the Uruk commander pressed on. Successfully landed a final strike that sent his opponent crashing to the ground. The injured Uruk leader believed losing his limbs had been a worthwhile price to pay. His breath coming in short bursts, he announced that the moment had finally arrived. He spoke to who lay unconscious and explained that once real nature, hidden away for so long, finally emerged, everything would change. Everyone who mattered to him would vanish from his life. Was destined to transform into a wild creature, losing all ability to restrain his primal urges. If he kept acting this way, he risked ending up all by himself. Once the Uruk commander uttered his last words, he fell to the ground, overcome by his wounds as body started to change, taking on a fiercer, more animalistic appearance. Upon witnessing the defeat of their leader, a surviving Uruk soldier recognized the hopelessness of their situation. Aware that victory was now impossible after their leader's sacrifice, he commanded the others to withdraw and seek shelter. Once the fighting was over, Cain led his group down from the wall so they could evaluate what had happened. They discovered lying unconscious yet breathing, and this sight left Cain in awe. One of the men remarked that Cain had personally witnessed, enduring numerous blows with his own body. In the brief period it took for them to descend, had already regained much of his strength. This rapid recovery left him questioning whether was truly just an ordinary ogre. Cain questioned whether could stand, given that the Uruk's weapons were laced with a powerful neurotoxin strong enough to bring down a troll, and realized they still had several important questions for him. Their conversation came to an abrupt halt when the monster commander's voice cut through the air, questioning the logic behind waking the monster, instead of simply questioning the injured person already sprawled on the ground. The group was startled to discover that the Uruk commander had survived, and one member accused another of failing to ensure the commander was truly dead. The Uruk commander, sensing his life fading away from the heavy loss of blood, calmly urged the others to remain calm. He believed that questioning someone who had already let go of the desire to live was the simplest kind of interrogation. One of the men cautioned Cain against letting his words influence him. After that, Cain started to question him. Cain explained that the Uruk had assembled the group of bandits, and then indicated the message he had sent. Cain observed that the writing was not in the Uruk language, which suggested it was meant for someone else who could understand it, and that individual had to be. Cain went on to clarify that had spent his entire life within the boundaries of this forest, never once venturing beyond it. It was clear that he couldn't have traveled to the wastelands or started any conflict with those people. Wanting answers, he confronted him, wanting to know about his connection to, and the reason for singling him out. The Uruk commander let out a loud laugh, already imagining how the others would handle the ogre from that moment forward. With his desire for revenge fulfilled sooner than expected, he felt no hesitation in responding to their questions. The Uruk commander started to explain that the idea of having secretly sheltered and defended the half-ogre was completely mistaken. He stated that as they took cover behind their enormous shield, word of his father, known as the Butcher of the Central Continent, had started to spread once more. Evidence soon emerged, revealing that the mastermind behind everything was a blue dragon. The announcement deeply surprised everyone when it was revealed. The Uruk went on to clarify, certain that the listeners already understood what ogres were like. He pointed out that a mature ogre would fight until the very end, never willing to surrender. Despite being a creature of unmatched power, the legendary beast unexpectedly decided to yield. He reflected on how his fixation had started at this very place, pondering what might have driven the creature to give up. He went on to explain that he had discovered the entire situation began due to a human woman, a revelation that left Cain stunned, and prompting him to question how this information was uncovered. The Uruk responded by noting a familiar scent of blood clinging to the very same odor as the butcher's blood, a smell that lingered vividly in his memory. Once his intentions were clear, the Uruk exposed his actual scheme. He had commanded his followers not to harm the hybrid under any circumstance. To enforce this, he assembled the Uruks and sent them into the woods to harass the creature, constructing an intricate maze that would discourage outsiders from venturing inside. The protective barrier, which everyone had trusted, was effectively fulfilling its role. However, none of it would have mattered unless the Uruks had claimed this forest as their own from the very start. He wrapped up his sarcastic remarks by pointing out that, Ultimately, nothing had been uncovered, and their only action was to conceal the half-hybrid until he eventually became this creature. In his last quiet moment of thought, he questioned whether seeking vengeance for his people genuinely mattered to him. It was unclear whether he simply wanted to become an outsider, just as he was. Following those final words, he exhaled one final breath and passed away. Meanwhile, the elders of the village gathered together, exchanging their thoughts in a quiet conversation. Among them, one elder remarked that Smother had done her best to guide him, but believed that Sm's inherent character was beyond her influence. He wondered if they could manage, should he grow even more similar to an ogre. Another observer noted that, despite the Uruk army's strict discipline, they were powerless to stand against him by themselves, and their survival had only been possible because of his intervention. There was a risk that, should he betray their trust, the safety of the whole village would be threatened. The village chief raised his voice, ordering everyone to end the conversation immediately. Cain, weighed down by sorrow over Sm's death, remained determined not to let the village suffer the same fate. He insisted that the chief find another solution if removing proved impossible, cautioning that dragon hunters would soon arrive in the village searching for him. The chief attempted to soothe Cain, expressing regret over Sm's misfortune, but also pointed out that, being just 13, had not acted by his own choice. He questioned the village elders' awareness of what mattered most to their community. Cain grew restless, insisting that immediate action was necessary before time ran out. Before he could finish, the chief interrupted, commanding him to be quiet and cautioning that the boy could overhear their conversation. At that time, was already awake and had listened to the whole conversation. He questioned in his mind whether the elders had begun arguing because of his actions, wondering if his outburst was the cause. He questioned his own actions, feeling uneasy at the thought that he might be acting just like his father, something he deeply resented. He despised knowing that others saw him this way. When the elders noticed he had regained consciousness, they reacted with astonishment. The village chief strolled alongside, offering comforting words and promising him that everything would be all right, and his health would soon improve. He explained that he was nearly recovered, though they had delayed informing his mother, and he hoped she would be understanding considering everything that had happened. The village chief expressed his gratitude to, emphasizing that regardless of others' opinions, had been the true savior of the village. Pride and thanks shone in the chief's words, listened and replied with a steady composure. The chief handed a bundle of medicinal herbs, instructing him to prepare and consume them with each meal once he got home. Grateful, expressed his appreciation, and mentioned that he would let his mother know about the instructions. Explained that he needed to leave since his mother was expecting him, adding that he hoped everyone inside was safe. The chief nodded in agreement, granting him permission to go. Made his way back home, his figure darting through the silvery glow of the moon. She arrived in a hurry. He arrived to find his mother standing outside, waiting for him. He touched down and shouted her name, trying to get her attention. He rushed over to her, cautioning her about the dangers of lingering close to the fence, particularly on a night such as this. His mother intervened, instructing him to pause and regain his composure. She assured him that she was all right and nothing unusual had happened there. However, she emphasized that this was not the main issue at hand. She turned to him and remarked that word had reached her about his personal involvement in the village's recent turmoil, despite her previous request for him to stay away. She noted that the others reported Sm's death near the outer fence and questioned whether that loss was the reason for his actions. Recalled the gentle encouragement had offered him in his youth, along with wistful hope that he might one day have a son as admirable as. Expressed regret to his mother for causing her concern. He confessed that witnessing Sm's death in such a manner was unbearable for him, revealing that held a unique place in his heart. He recalled Sm's last advice to him, urging that he must always keep his calm, no matter what happened. Questioned inwardly whether felt apprehensive about what awaited him, or about the possibilities of uncovering unsettling truths. He turned his gaze toward his mother, wondering if the fierceness he displayed came from his father. His mother pleaded with him to stop, her expression tightening with discomfort as she offered an apology, explaining that she was unable to give him an answer. raised his voice, urgently trying to get her attention. She moved away from, apologizing again and again, but he stopped her and pulled her into an embrace. In another part of the world, deep within the kingdom of Nestled In, the Baron confronted his knight, with frustration. The Baron expressed his outrage over rumors of a dragon hunt, calling the idea foolish and pointless. He questioned whether everyone had forgotten the original reasons the hunt was forbidden. He ridiculed their discussions about traditions and wants, believing they failed to grasp what was actually possible. He maintained a sarcastic tone, doubting whether their attempts could ever measure up to Smite, and questioned the logic behind trying to find a blue dragon. The Baron explained to his knight, whom he regarded as his most reliable companion, that he would have faced serious difficulties without help, since disregarding the sacred mobilization command was impossible. Offered words of comfort in response. He assured him that he had fulfilled the necessary responsibilities for now, leaving no reason for the motherland to object and granting them a brief period of respite. Hermann observed that, just as the Baron had foreseen, this dragon-hunting expedition was filled with an unexpected amount of odd occurrences. He admired his master's keen perception, disclosing that their inquiry had uncovered the existence of a creature born from both ogre and human parents. The Baron celebrated, expressing his satisfaction that this was exactly the kind of practical solution he had envisioned, and confidently assured everyone that the hunt would be worthwhile. Hermann, as expected, agreed with him. Following the Baron's command for patience, Hermann fixed him with a frosty stare, silently imagining the near future when the Baron's head would become just another trophy among his gruesome collection. In another part of, an individual inquired about someone who went by the name Tilak. The mercenary blocked the path of the masked man, and with a mocking tone, questioned whether the so-called honorable knights truly believed that dealing with a mercenary would be simple. The mercenary became aware of 3 individuals trailing behind them, expressed his frustration to the man wearing a mask, insisting that things were not unfolding as he had expected. According to, the plan should have allowed them to finish the mission swiftly. The masked man shot a piercing glare, his voice cold as he made it clear that disrespect was unacceptable. He reminded that being from did not grant him immunity, and if he didn't learn to show respect, his life could be cut short before their mission even started. Tilak expressed his concern about their situation, questioning whether they could deal with any pursuers if something went wrong, and admitted he doubted they were prepared to confront an ogre in the forest. The masked man quietly spoke under his breath, uttering the phrase, practical feasibility. At the same time, found himself by himself in the middle of the woods. He understood that waiting any longer was not an option, and he would have to begin the hunt before nightfall arrived. Because he was unable to go back to the village for some time, he needed to look after himself. Ventured out into the wilderness, determined to track down and capture a wild boar. He used an ability he had never realized was his. He realized it felt as though he was learning to hunt for the very first time. He understood that his mother had likely chosen not to teach him that, wanting him to grow up experiencing life as a human as fully as he could. He realized that this made sense to him. Once he landed a powerful blow on the boar, the animal collapsed onto the ground. Wondered if his ability to move with agility and sense, the instincts of animals, came from his father's lineage. The predator used cunning to deceive its target, wearing it down until it became tired, and then took advantage of a brief lapse in focus to attack a vulnerable spot. He questioned within himself whether his mother feared seeing traces of his father reflected in him. In the forest, the masked man traveled with his group, making their way through the woods. Tilak continued to grumble, painting the forest as a confusing maze filled with dangerous goblins and disciplined trolls launching attacks on them. The masked man's eyes widened at the mention of a trained troll, clearly not expecting such a thing. Sensing his disbelief, Tilak responded with a sarcastic tone, questioning whether he truly thought a race war could happen in a place as isolated as this. The masked man thought the claim was blown out of proportion, yet Tilak remained firm, assuring him that it was something along those lines. Tilak noted that villages linked to the merchant guild could be found even in these far-off regions, making his point clear with a gesture. Recently, turmoil had erupted among the neighboring orcs, with the source of the unrest revealed to be the Uruk from. The masked man realized he knew the name, recalling that this individual had played a major role in the conflict between the races. Tillich found it odd that he had traveled such a distance and glanced at the masked man with a cunning grin. He wanted to know what the masked man thought, suggesting that the situation appeared to involve more than simply tracking down an animal. The masked man explained that many unexpected things awaited him, urging him to be quick since their destination was near. As the group moved forward, the masked man's allies sprang into action, launching a surprise attack on a nearby goblin. They questioned the goblin thoroughly, yet he remained firm in his claim that he had already revealed all the information he possessed. The masked man's companion considered the situation, realizing that with the Uruk now dead, he came to understand that Herman had been right all along. Until then, he had believed it was merely an ordinary village. He explained to his companion that Herman intended to trail the mercenary to a different location that appeared to have ties to their target. One of the group members reacted with astonishment at this unexpected shift, since they were supposed to gather at the village gate, yet the leader remained vague and offered no proper explanation. The leader suspected that Herman had discovered something there that had captured his attention even more. He gave his men clear directions, prompting them to start moving towards home as planned. Herself with chores inside the house, she suddenly remembered the moment when questioned her about his dad. Without warning, sensed an intruder lurking just beyond the door, attempting to force their way inside the house. A short while afterward, rushed into the room and loudly announced that the place was empty. He hadn't expected to encounter her there, and astonishment flickered across his face. With a mocking tone, he offered an apology for disturbing her, pretending he had been unaware that a lady of such remarkable beauty was present. Spoke with a steady voice as she acknowledged his return to see her. She mentioned that she was unsure why he had come, but noted that it had been quite a while since anyone from the village had reached out. She also stated that her son was now leading a peaceful life. She informed him that nothing remained for them to achieve in this place. Tillich scoffed at her statement, sarcastically calling the moment enjoyable, and hurled an insult at her. He accused her of favoring the brute strength of a savage ogre over the dignity of her noble birth, going so far as to claim she was beneath even the village prostitutes. Of a recognized warrior, formally declared his intention to meet with Princess of the Arcadian Empire. Herman, his face hidden behind a mask, stepped into the room. Herman was taken aback to discover her in such modest surroundings, and thought to himself that spending her days in this place was an act of extraordinary selflessness. Herman moved ahead and presented himself as a knight serving. She requested that she come back with them to their native country. Explained that she was unsure how the truth had managed to travel all the way to such an isolated area, yet she acknowledged that nothing could be done now because it was already too late. She remarked that the they remembered would never have taken so long to find her, and since she had remained on her own until this moment, the issue had already been resolved. In response, explained that she had been formally recognized as deceased, yet had always held on to hope, suggesting that Her Highness still had the opportunity to come back whenever she wished. Herman wondered aloud whether she found her present circumstances to be intolerable. He comforted her, urging her to let go of her fears, and promised that he would be the one to cleanse her of that tainted blood. Beyond the building, a masked figure outlined his strategy to his team. He explained that their target frequently stayed at this location, and despite being a hybrid, acted just like an ogre, implying that his actions were driven by simple animal instincts. The masked man also remarked that, while rumors claimed was capable of speech, he ultimately believed that an ogre would always be an ogre. He felt a wave of relief, admitting that he had worried about appearing too much like a regular person, especially since he was still just 13. He then instructed the group to get ready for the ogre hunt and encouraged them to make progress before their meeting with Master Herman. At the same time, made his way back carrying the wild boar he had hunted. He realized it was getting late and became aware that the scent of the meat was especially unpleasant. While the odor did not bother him, he remembered how much his mother disliked it. With this in mind, he planned to request that Aunt Ben use plenty of spices to mask the strong smell. He started to feel anxious, noticing that his mother's expression had grown increasingly sorrowful in recent days. She no longer responded to his questions, which led him to believe that the recent events were somehow his fault. Made his way home, silently wishing for his mother's quick recovery. Without warning, his eyes grew wide with shock, and before he could make sense of the situation, a group of assailants sprang out and surrounded him. Despite his injuries, he summoned his strength and launched a determined counterattack. They felt bewildered as they tried to figure out why the attack had happened and where it had come from. He suddenly understood that he hadn't noticed any scent or sign of them right before they launched their attack. He determined without a doubt that the hunt had been carefully planned. Scanning his surroundings with growing unease, he searched desperately for any sign of his pursuers. They found themselves curious about the identities of the people before them. He kept evading each strike that came his way. He suffered another injury, a deep wound, when one of the masked attackers struck him from behind. Collapsed onto the ground, clutching at his agony and questioning the cause of his suffering. He believed that, until now, his life had been spent concealed in absolute tranquility. The reason for their pursuit of him resurfaced in his mind. He believed that what was happening was deeply unfair. One of the assailants lifted his sword, preparing to strike the decisive blow. His gaze gleamed with resolve as he made up his mind to persevere from that moment forward. At the same time, within the house, Tillich taunted Herman. He was seen as a reliable man, weary from working under a newly wealthy noble who had purchased his own rank. He held the noble responsible for making him lose his self-control in that critical moment. Tillich persisted with his harsh remarks, firmly believing that nobles such as himself were worthless. His earlier dismissive glances toward him revealed themselves to be mere acts of careless bravado, lacking any genuine substance. Herman reflected privately, convinced that others could dispute the matter all they liked, yet the outcome would remain unchanged and not favor them. Explained to the group that, ultimately, it would be the newcomer who ended up spilling blood. Without warning, Herman's gaze snapped to the door, his expression filled with astonishment. At that instant, charged into the room with determination, reaching out swiftly to seize Herman. He halted just short of making contact, giving Herman the chance to raise his sword and aim it directly at him. Deftly blocked Herman's quick sword attack, matching his opponent's speed with practiced precision. Herman watched in awe, impressed by his swift and nimble movements, and found himself curious about the place where had acquired such remarkable agility. The collision between them unleashed a burst of energy so intense that it left Tillich momentarily paralyzed with shock. Tillich considered how unusually bold Herman was acting, and suspected that Herman might be concealing his real abilities. Two hadn't expected to encounter a sword master in such a location. Herman stood tall, his sword radiating light as he shielded his mother from the oncoming assaults. Watched in distress, her voice trembling as she called out to him, fear evident in her cry. Reassured that she was safe from harm, encouraging him to remain calm. She then insisted that he should hide and leave the area as quickly as possible. Herman unleashed a surge of energy from his sword, striking and causing him to scream in agony. Herman declared that the upcoming round would show no leniency. Before anything else, he paused to hear if his humble lips would offer any final justifications. Kama questioned how such a simple creature managed to overcome a knight, despite the knight only being a beginner. He marveled in disbelief as he tried to understand how it had occurred. The story briefly shifts back to the forest, revealing the masked man's companions struggling to catch their breath. He explained that, despite being merely a minor creature, he had never taken pleasure in harming the young. His companion observed that he didn't appear to fit the description. Meanwhile, the man realized was a bit shorter than a typical adult ogre. The man explained that there was no use fighting back, insisting that could never alter the circumstances of his birth. The prey seemed to exist solely for the purpose of being pursued. In a flash, reacted with remarkable quickness, effortlessly evading the strike aimed at him by the man. The sudden movement caught her off guard, leaving her stunned. Struck back fiercely, managing to inflict a serious injury on his opponent. His companion stared at him in disbelief, amazed by how precisely had anticipated every move. The injured assailant questioned within himself whether such a feat could be achieved, despite all his training as a creature. Even more significant was the fact that it made no sense, since should have been both unconscious and overcome with fury at this moment. A different man, his anger barely contained, questioned whether the toxic substance had failed to do its job. Determined not to give a chance to regain his strength, he made up his mind to eliminate him without delay. Stood his ground without fear, showing through his composed demeanor that he was already aware the needles hurled at him had been laced with poison. They intended to transform him into a creature fit for the chase. The man felt a surge of surprise at its cleverness and quick grasp of what was happening, noticing that even seemed attuned to the subtle sounds and presence of the forest around them. Questioned the group about any wrongs he might have committed against them, wondering if simply being born as he was truly made him deserving of death. He shifted the focus back to them, questioning whether the creatures they had encountered up to that point had chosen to sacrifice themselves for their sake, before launching his own assault. His wild action sent the man crashing to the ground, a terrified scream escaping him as he fell. The attacker soon understood that was releasing the poison circulating through his body as a hallucinogenic mist, turning it into a weapon against them. Now the situation had changed, and they found themselves hunted instead. Darted swiftly through the crowd, so fast that the man watching grew fearful, realizing he hadn't managed to lay a finger on him. They noticed that the smoke which had masked their scent had now dissipated. A surge of panic washed over him, knowing that if nothing changed, would inevitably make his way to Master Herman. Such a situation was not supposed to occur under any circumstances. Questioned his own nature, uncertain whether he was a beast or a man, and pondered if the distinction truly held any importance. He began to consider which shape would allow him to survive. At the same time, Herman questioned whether the moment had arrived, but ultimately dismissed its importance, resolving to personally question his disciples at a later time. Herman glanced at, briefly admitting that he had wondered what it might be like to see things from a beast's perspective. Without showing any warmth, he then instructed to ensure his death was obvious and witnessed by his own mother. In this manner, the princess would soon lose her resolve. Herman launched his assault, yet stood his ground with unwavering determination, making it clear through his actions that he would not allow Herman to have his way. Skillfully deflected Herman's strike as he shielded his mother from harm. Firmly reiterated his determination, making it clear that he refused to allow the other person to get what he wanted. Herman shot an angry glare in his direction as muttered under his breath in the background, frustrated by the chaos and questioning why everyone who wielded the aura blade seemed to have such a quick temper. He silently reflected on how everything was unfolding just as he had intended. Sprang out of the house, deliberately distancing himself from his mother to ensure she remained safe, even if he unleashed all of his power during the fight. Herman paused for a moment, focusing on collecting his strength. Without warning, he revealed a lengthy spear that radiated with a powerful, luminous energy. He infused the spear with his own inner power. The character unleashed a powerful and destructive assault. The weapon was pointed toward, unleashing a tremendous blast that erupted into a powerful explosion. From afar, the masked man's companion witnessed the sudden explosion, and filled with astonishment, recognized Master Herman as the cause. Frustration bubbled within him as he speculated whether that ogre had finally pushed Herman too far. He told his companion that, unlike most, Master always chose to wield a long spear because it was more practical. Even though many people looked down on this weapon and thought it was only fit for farmers, preferred it for its usefulness. Herman was well aware of its unique hunting abilities, yet he reserved its use for only the most exceptional situations, indicating just how grave things had become. The man, his voice brimming with excitement, announced that he had witnessed the explosion. This information allowed them to pinpoint Master Herman's whereabouts, prompting him to instruct his companion to advance as quickly as possible. However, the other person cautioned him that if they moved too fast, the night beasts might notice them, putting both of their lives at serious risk. The first person responded with frustration, admitting that their carelessness had already allowed the ogre to get away. They realized that the knight's scolding was now more frightening than the creatures themselves, and understood that they had to act without delay. They hurried toward the spot where the spear had originated. In another part of the woods, made his way among the trees. He experienced a wave of dizziness and confusion, likely caused by the poison. Without meaning to, his body began to act independently. He questioned whether this instinct, the drive to pursue, was something passed down to him from his father. He noticed his instincts as a hunter had grown sharper, believing that a true hunter would never stop chasing its target, particularly when that target was a person. Herman's spear emerged, pursuing closely. Without warning, he was struck by a powerful surge of energy as the spear hurtled toward him with incredible velocity, delivering a devastating blow that left him badly injured. The chief of the village discussed with a group of elders. They spotted strange smoke drifting up near her home and began to question whether something had gone wrong after everything had seemed peaceful for a while. One member of the group recalled that Ken had given them a warning about his family, saying that problems would arise soon and they needed to stay alert. Some villagers questioned whether it was right to do nothing while and could be facing danger, and proposed that they should at least look into the situation. However, the village chief was reluctant, pointing out that was together with, and if the problem was too much for to manage, there would be little they could do to help. As the chief pondered, uncertainty filled his mind about whether protecting the village should come before everything else. An elder raised concerns, expressing the belief that protecting could actually endanger the entire village. He declared that, should the defense team fail, he would take action personally. Upon seeing this, the rest of the group chose to go after him, heading in the direction where the smoke was rising. Deep within the forest, a group of wolves tracked his trail, drawn by the sharp scent of his fresh wound. Within the forest, the masked man's allies advanced in the direction of where Herman was situated. Once the masked man's allies arrived at the location, Herman comes across his coworkers lying on the ground, clearly overwhelmed and beaten. The leader informed Herman that they had arrived after the critical moment and that there was no hope for them to succeed. In response, Herman replied with a hint of sarcasm, questioning whether he should take the statement as an offense. The man, his voice filled with urgency, pleaded for him to exercise the utmost caution. She clarified to him that, despite the ogre's intelligence, it acted out of instinct rather than reasoning. Herman explained to the group that not only had his natural instincts, but also the intellect of a human, and that he now behaved with the restraint of a person. The man explained that they were simply assistants, supporting Master Herman in his tasks. Herman responded positively, then questioned whether it would be practical to let them live. After that, he instructed them to offer him their hands that were not holding swords. While he considered what challenge awaited him next, he observed as the elders from the village made their entrance. A smile spread across their face as they noted with satisfaction that the bait had appeared precisely when needed. A villager started to question Herman about the reason for their visit, yet the elder quickly quieted him before he could say more. A villager turned to the chief, expressing doubt about whether they could overcome Herman and his group. The story moves back in time, revealing an elderly man cautioning his son about the dangers of defying the Lord. He explained that his son's act of rebellion was nothing more than an immature outburst, and insisted that such defiance would only lead to trouble. The son explained that the taxes had climbed to 70%, warning that they would go hungry if they kept supporting the lords. Hearing this, the father questioned whether this was the sole reason for his son's decision. The son explained that nothing had been the same since the farmer's daughters were executed in the town square. He reminded his father that when the youngest girls were about to be sent to serve the Lord after dark, it was their father who had declared he would prefer to risk his life escaping than allow such a fate. The son confessed his awareness of his father's covert encounters with the girl, admitting that he had been the one to encourage her escape. The father cautioned his son about the dangers of harboring unjustified hatred, prompting the son to offer an apology. The resistance to Lord had grown far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Up to that point the Lord had not spoken, but at last he took action. The story shifts back in time, exposing what happened as a result of that act of defiance. Lord acted with the calm assurance of someone who had anticipated events, unfolding exactly in this manner. He replied with a composure and grace that reflected his position and self-respect. He crushed the region's initial major uprising by resorting to brutal force. The rebellion concluded in utter defeat, leaving its participants with nothing accomplished and none of their goals fulfilled. The father stood hidden among the crowd, his eyes fixed on his son's lifeless form suspended in the middle of the square. Powerless to intervene, he realized that witnessing this heartbreaking scene from afar was all he was able to manage. Despite everything, the Lord showed no concern and left the father's role as the supply official exactly as it was. As soon as the father understood the situation, he made up his mind to escape from. A lasting terror had settled into that place, ensuring it would never be forgotten. The origins of this profound trauma could be traced back to when three mysterious figures, working under the cover of night, wiped out 400 without suffering any injuries themselves. The story shifts back to the present, where the village chief sits quietly, his mind filled with memories of the tragedy that befell his son. While fear spread through the village, the people raised their voices, desperately seeking guidance from their chief. Without warning, a member of Herman's group sprang into action. One of the elders began to speak, but before he could complete his words, the man suddenly attacked, plunging a blade into the elder named Den and ending his life. The chief cried out Henderson's name in fear, but before he could react, a different man struck Henderson with a fatal stab, ending his life instantly. Herman spoke to the chief in an even tone, assuring him that the recent event was not cause for bitterness, but rather the result of a rightful execution. He remarked in a frosty tone that one ought to show courtesy before addressing a knight, and he mocked the chief by questioning whether he was unaware of such a rule. After that, he stated that he would make an exception this time and allow the chief a single opportunity. She questioned him, wanting to know if he was absolutely certain that he did not wish for any additional executions. Somewhere else after he had been hurt. After the enormous blast, he plummeted down from the sky. He questioned internally whether coming into the world like this had been an error. He wondered if he ought to surrender to destiny and let himself die without resistance. He considered which shape would suit him best. As he plunged downward, a group of creatures resembling wolves, their eyes glowing red, started to assemble beneath him, attracted by his presence. He wondered if they would permit him to stay alive. Not much is actually understood about ogres, even though they are real. The creatures closed in, forming a circle around as he lay wounded. His mother tells him about creatures known for their incredible speed or overwhelming strength. However, ogres choose a path that is entirely separate from all others. They constantly chose to go their own way, but a distinctive ability made them stand out from everyone else. The question remained unanswered about how this lone animal managed to rule over the woods it called home. Their true nature description, aside from relying on overly dramatic facial expressions. It seemed to be the sole method that occurred to anyone when attempting to explain them. At the same time, the village elders stood before them. Ken peered through his binoculars and spotted Herman drawing closer, holding the village chief captive by his side. Herman struck without warning, unleashing a forceful assault. He channeled the blue aura and unleashed his assault against the fortress wall that guarded the village. The event triggered an immense burst of energy, unleashing widespread devastation. One of Ken's subordinates cried out in surprise, pointing out that their position was still safe from harm and proposed that they strike back quickly, but Ken immediately halted his suggestion. Ken came to the unsettling understanding that if Herman had chosen to, he possessed the power to eliminate every one of them in an instant. He realized that he had intentionally failed to hit the mark in order to signal the others to give up, since he was holding someone captive. Because of this, they understood that they shouldn't risk upsetting him and needed to delay their actions for as long as they could. Ken's gaze shifted to the village chief, noticing that he stood by himself with no other villagers around him. Ken, feeling a surge of anxiety, reached out to one of his men named Jack to inquire whether the village chief had arrived to meet them by himself. Jack explained that the chief had arrived with his own bodyguards. Ken felt a surge of concern upon hearing the news. Without hesitation, he instructed the team to halt their search and verify who was accompanying the chief before proceeding. Determined to handle the situation personally, Ken declared that he would be the one to stall for time. The men around him voiced their concerns, believing it was far too risky for him to venture out by himself. Ken remained adamant and commanded that, should any trouble arise, the villagers were to be led to safety using a hidden tunnel beneath the ground. In situations like this, the existence of a human being meant nothing to their foes. Herman reflected on the Baron's remarks, noting how the Baron seemed to place himself beyond any boundaries. Herman questioned silently whether anything in the world could actually resist the Baron's wishes, and pondered where such a person's boundaries could possibly lie. He also considered how others might perceive the journey toward a goal, especially when the outcome was already certain to align with the Baron's desires. He questioned him with a mocking tone, doubting that anyone truly thought his journey from the lowest point to success was solely due to determination. The Baron clarified, too, that his intentions were not to downplay or dismiss the hardships had endured. The Baron emphasized that rational thinking required acknowledging the presence of someone with influential qualities, treating it as an essential factor that could not be overlooked. Upon realizing that this task could not be accomplished by just one individual, attention naturally turned toward solutions that were tangible and achievable. From afar, silently promised himself that he would not allow events to unfold according to his adversary's desires. Ken moved ahead to confront Herman, expressing his belief that someone as honorable as Herman could never grasp their lifestyle. He intended to demonstrate the way people interacted in this place, since this would serve as his way of saying hello. Herman quickly understood that Ken's actions were just an attempt to delay things. He questioned him with a mocking tone, doubting that events would unfold according to his desires. Without warning, a fierce assault sent Ken crashing to the floor, prompting an elder nearby to cry out his name in fear. The village chief pleaded with Herman to direct all retribution toward himself, insisting that the rest of the villagers were innocent and unaware. He insisted that serving as bait was sufficient for him, desperately urging the other person not to interfere any further. Herman reached the end of his patience and raised his voice, demanding that it stop. He then unleashed a fierce assault, swiftly defeating the last of the elders with the strength of his sword blows. Ken was found sprawled on the ground at the center of the battlefield. Herman glanced over at Ken, noticing how he seemed barely clinging to life, his body battered and exhausted. It became clear to Herman in that moment that their fight was far from finished. With a smug grin, Herman proclaimed that this was merely the start, declaring that the chase was only now commencing. He commanded his soldiers to fill the grimy forest with the stench of blood. Suddenly everyone charged toward, launching their assault at once. As the battle started, Herman responded with a mocking laugh. Was reproached for acting so impulsively that he left his mother behind. He confronted him face to face. Herman aimed his sword straight at, channeling energy along the blade to amplify both its strength and the impact behind his attack. He released a powerful surge of sword energy, swirling with destructive force. Herman observed that was moving in an unusual way. He ridiculed the boy for having the audacity to fight back, believing that the boy had nothing left to lose. He raised his voice, accusing the other person of being just like everyone else. Without warning, she struck him with tremendous force. He showed clear signs of disappointment. In the midst of his overconfidence, Herman found himself ambushed on every side by creatures resembling wolves, their ferocious assault catching him completely off guard. Herman could hardly believe it when the assault came out of nowhere, leaving him stunned. The creatures attacked him with such ferocity that he was left gravely injured. Herman's companions struggled to breathe as blood spilled from his mouth, the severity of his injuries causing his health to deteriorate with each passing moment. He silently blamed himself for the predicament, realizing that his brief lapse in vigilance had led to this moment. A thick cloud of dust and steam filled the surroundings, making it difficult for him to see clearly. As he observed the scene, he noticed that the vapor escaping from the creature's injuries carried traces of an unfamiliar substance. After considering everything, They realized that the entire situation had been carefully designed as a hunting trap. A massive creature emerged from the mist, its eyes shining an eerie red. The creature turned out to be a scavenger. Just then emerged from behind, ready to resume the battle. The battle raged on, while Herman's companion seethed with anger, recognizing that was once again using the manipulative tactics he had used against him back in the forest. He questioned whether he had brought him all this distance merely to play another trick on him. Quickly overcame his opponent, aided by the scavenger beasts that joined in the attack, leaving the others' resistance short-lived. They delivered injuries that proved to be deadly for him, seized his opponent and shoved him down, holding him firmly against the ground. The man collapsed onto the floor as blood began to pool beneath him. In a state of hopelessness, she turned to, seeking an explanation for his actions. The man remarked that leaving him in such a battered state would have been pointless, and it would have made more sense to finish him off during their previous encounter. Answered with a fierce roar, leading the man to believe that was eager to demonstrate even greater strength. In his last moments, he came to understand that was fundamentally unlike any of the other beasts he had battled before. At that instant, Herman stepped into the conflict and unleashed a sweeping assault. Was holding his companion when the injury occurred. The attacker launched into a heated battle with, lunged toward Herman with incredible speed, closing the distance between them in an instant. With a swift move, Herman sent sprawling onto the floor. The figure loomed above him, tauntingly ridiculing him and referring to him as a creature born of mixed origins. He questioned whether he truly understood what it meant to be a knight, silently promising to personally show him the harsh reality of that lesson in a way he would never forget. At the same time, within the house, Tillich engaged in conversation with. Tillich assumed that the creature, who had burst into tears merely by thinking about its mother, had escaped without a second glance. He decided that the only explanation was that his wife must have pleaded with the beast to go after her. He believed she dreaded the idea of being by herself with him. Explained that any mother would naturally be concerned for her child. She went on to inquire how she might ease his resentment toward her son. Looked at her predicament with scorn, ridiculing her by labeling her as pitiful. He recalled her past as the esteemed daughter of a powerful kingdom, where she enjoyed a life of comfort and privilege, and questioned how she had ended up in such difficult circumstances. He mentioned that there was little time left and chose not to explain further. It became clear that his resentment stemmed from more than just her unruly son. However, even in this difficult moment, she still clung to her unwavering pride. She had regarded him with such scorn, her eyes suggesting he was nothing more than an unwanted weed. He announced that confidence would only come to him after completely crushing that pride without hesitation. At that instant, an unusual green light burst forth, filling the space with its eerie radiance. Without warning, a strange green light burst forth from the area behind's mother. Without warning, a warrior emerged and launched an unexpected assault on. Herman let out a startled scream, his mind racing with confusion over the sudden turn of events as he desperately tried to make sense of it all, uttering her true name in disbelief. Beyond the walls, and were locked in an intense fight, their movements punctuated by bursts of blue light as they exchanged powerful blows. Herman questioned in his mind how much longer intended to keep escaping from his problems. Gathered all his strength, lowered his shoulder, and launched himself forward like a battering ram, catching Herman off guard with a sudden, forceful collision. Herman raised his sword just in time to meet's powerful attack, yet the impact was so overwhelming that it forced Herman backward, his heels scraping against the earth as he struggled to maintain his balance. Herman started to believe that the conflict between hunter and prey might go on forever, unless one of them found a way to bring it to a close. Herman observed an unfamiliar energy seeping from, something unlike anything he had witnessed in the past. He inwardly mocked the thought that someone like a mere hybrid could rise to rule the forest so quickly. He maintained a sarcastic attitude, finding his actions amusing and questioning if this was the extent of his abilities. A massive creature emerged behind Herman and lunged at him, aiming to catch him off guard. However, Herman noticed the threat just in time, spun around swiftly, and evaded the beast's assault. Herman struck with such force that he severed the creature's hand from its arm. Herman refused to show any mercy to the creature and immediately attacked, calling upon his combat abilities. Every time his sword struck, the creature's breathing grew more labored. He struck one last, powerful hit that ripped the creature apart, leaving its shredded remains strewn across the ground. Herman gasped for air, his chest heaving as he struggled to steady his breathing, while thick droplets of the creature's blood dripped down from overhead, splattering him like a sinister rainfall. Stared at Herman in disbelief, marveling at the revelation that Herman was a knight. In response, Herman's lips curled into a mocking smile as he shot back with a question of his own, curious about what assumptions had made about him before. Observed that such behavior was typical for a knight, noting how Herman stood apart from regular soldiers. Despite his condition, Herman had still managed to sidestep the trap had prepared for him. Herman was overcome with intense anger. The man insulted by labeling him a useless hybrid and promised to get revenge on him for having the audacity to respond defiantly. Ridiculed him, pointing out that, despite being a knight, he failed to exploit any vulnerabilities and was nothing more than's puppet. Herman, his voice edged with anger, reminded the other man that he was overstepping his boundaries. Herman hurled his sword infusing it with a fierce inner power that sent the weapon hurtling toward its target at blinding speed. With no room to dodge, braced himself and blocked the attack by letting the sword strike his shoulder, his actions fueled by desperation. Herman promised to personally show him the true meaning behind those words. Narrowly dodged the blow, just as a wolf sprang out and sank its teeth into Herman's hand. Seized the moment and struck with overwhelming force. Herman was hurled through the air as a result. When the fighting ceased, the village chief remained in the ruins, cradling the lifeless body of a friend lost in the struggle. The character observed the situation quietly, their heart weighed down by profound sadness. Gripped neck firmly, showing that had been beaten. Herman's mind seethed with anger as he recalled how he had once branded both the lowest scoundrel in and a servant to the Uruks. He made it clear how appalled he was that individuals like himself had been responsible for reducing the continent's knights to such a pitiful condition. In response, questioned what purpose these threats served, confidently stating that he had already surpassed what it meant to be a knight and was fully capable of doing so repeatedly. Herman speculated that's connection to the title suggested he was also from. In response, admitted that he had never intended for the situation to escalate this far. Herman, overcome by fury as he thinks about all the pain he has gone through to get where he is, lets out a furious yell and throws a final, decisive punch that ends his opponent once and for all. Found himself alone in the ruins, the aftermath of his battle with Herman still lingering in the air. After the fighting ended, stepped outside her home and began searching for. Stepped out from behind the house, making his presence known. Despite her earlier instructions for him to escape, he had come back after the battle. He explained his decision by insisting that he had to stay, since the attackers intended to use the villagers as a trap. Criticized his choice, pointing out the danger he had faced, and questioned whether he truly valued a community that once rejected him more than his own life. Maintained his belief that their hosts were kind-hearted individuals who had offered them protection, though he acknowledged that fear and weakness had shaped their actions. She cautioned him that their cause was not worth sacrificing his life. Because of the recent events, he felt stunned by the realization that they might attempt to leave him behind once more. Understood that this was actually a very real possibility. She began to wonder if what the woman said could actually be real. He realized that, in order to stay safe in this world, he needed to follow her instructions. Wanted to know how was feeling, and was curious about what had occurred with T-Lock. She explained to that had just departed when the knight failed to come back. Observing his exhaustion, suggested he take a break, assuring him that they could handle the cleanup afterward. Nodded in agreement, and assured her that he would also arrange a spot where she could relax. He paused, confessing that he had fought because he believed it was the only way they could stay together, and pleaded with her not to ask him to flee again. Later that evening, observed him quietly while he slept. He glanced down at the vibrant green pendant hanging from his neck, its light casting a soft glow. At the same time, the villagers assembled in a circle around a roaring bonfire at the heart of their village. Inside the village hall, the scene unfolded. The chief sat by himself, anxiety evident in his expression. He recalled talking with Ken, who had assured him that was the reason he did not blame him for death. Ken questioned whether he could assure that a similar disaster would never happen again. The thought served as a warning to him, emphasizing the risks that knights faced if they allowed themselves to recall such memories in this world. Inside the village hall, the chief sat anxiously, his mind heavy with concern, when an intense green light suddenly illuminated the space before him. From the blinding light, an enormous figure clad in armor emerged, making it clear to the chief that trouble had already started. The chief addressed the armored figure as, expressing amazement at its command over its power and wondering aloud if had been observing everything from the beginning. Acknowledged that he had warned the chief about the possibility of this day arriving. He pointed out that, even though they had faced countless threats throughout the last 14 years, the current predicament stood apart. Emphasized that the princess would no longer be truly safe as long as maintained his ties to a knight. The chief considered whether the issue might have arisen due to the presence of onlookers, focusing in particular on the bearded mercenary. Calmly explained that steps had already been put in place to keep the person quiet, and he had taken care of everything on his side. A sudden realization struck the chief, must have already reached out to. Paused, holding back any words, as silence filled the air for several moments. As slept in his room, he inquired with the chief regarding the choice she had made. Sat beside her son's pendant, quietly composing a letter as silent tears traced down her cheeks.